A few years ago, I had an appointment in Los Angeles, so I was just there, and I was there with my wife, Sue, and that's where I was raised, and she just kind of off the cuff said, "Hey, should we go try to find the house that you were raised in? See if it's still there? Take a look?" And I immediately became sick. A wave of nausea came over me. I paused, I took a deep breath, and I said, "Yeah, let's go. Let's go find it." So in our little rental car, we drove to 2112 East Renton Street in Carson City, California, in the Los Angeles area. Pulled up on the other side of the street and just stopped in front of that house and looked. And that's where it all happened. It was overwhelming, really. I hadn't been there since 4th of July, many years ago. I'll come back to the 4th of July in just a moment. But as I looked at that house, and I looked at the door, and it was way older now, same 3 concrete steps, 1, 2, 3, up to the door. There was a new fence around the front yard. I wasn't able to go look in the backyard to see if the same fence was there. But it was that fence in the backyard that was most traumatic for me. That's the fence where I was forced to stand as a little boy with a beer can balanced on my head, while my father and his friends sat there with a scope rifle pointed at me, telling me that if I drop it, he would blow my head off. I would stand there as long as I could, shaking, trembling. Inevitably, I would drop it, and he would pull the trigger and click, and they would laugh their heads off. It was in that house that things happened that developed for me what I refer to now as my first addiction ritual. It wasn't to a substance, it was to a thought process, more like a feeling process, actually, because I wasn't sure what to think. I was a little boy. So thoughts had to catch up later. At that point, all it was just raw emotion. And the addiction ritual that I developed was that every day I would come home from school, as all little boys do, and I would come up to that house, and I would just look at the door and the 3 steps and just feel sick. Literally nothing could make me voluntarily open the door and go into that house. Couldn't do it. Couldn't make myself go in the house. So I would throw my little lunch pail on the porch, and I would open the little white gate, and I'd go into the front yard, and I had strategically nailed 3 boards to the trunk of that tree so that I could maneuver my little body up and grab the first branch. Pull myself up and climb as high as I possibly could. And I had discovered a kind of perfect cradle. The branches were just perfect for straddling and just kind of reclining back. And I would just sit there, feeling feelings. And my addiction ritual was, at the time I didn't call it this, but it was detachment. I was addicted to detachment. I was addicted to trying not to feel what I felt. And so I would just sit there in the tree, trying not to feel those feelings. And then I developed a second addiction, and that addiction was to a raging hatred of the man in that house that was beating my mother. I hated him so much that I would, in my imagination, I would picture myself as a little boy creeping in the night through the house after everybody was asleep and going to that drawer that I knew that drawer. I saw him put guns in that drawer. I knew there were guns in that drawer. And I would picture my little self going over to that drawer and pulling it open and taking out a pistol and walking quietly over to the bed and putting it to his head and pulling the trigger. Over and over again, I rehearsed this plan as a little boy. Inevitably, my mom would come out and yell up into the tree, "Ty, you need to come down, come in the house. You need to come in. It's time to eat." I knew and she knew why I was there. And she, in compassion, I think, would always let me stay there as long as possible. She didn't want to make me come in to that house. But one day everything changed. I got to my house, threw my things on the porch, climbed up to the top of the tree, just got comfortable on my branch. And my mom immediately came out of the house. There was an energy about her this time. It wasn't casual. She didn't let me stay there. She came straight out of the house. She yelled up in the tree, "Ty, come down from the tree now. I need to talk to you before Charlie gets home." It was weird because she had never called him Charlie before to me or to any of us children. There were 4 of us. I was the oldest of the 4 children, 2 younger brothers and a younger sister. She had never called him Charlie. Always your dad or daddy. But I knew his name was Charlie because I heard her call him Charlie. And I heard his friends call him Charlie. I knew he was Charlie, but she had never said Charlie to me. It was weird. "Come down. I need to talk to you before Charlie gets home." I quickly came down from the tree. I went into the house, and my mom led me into a back room in the house where we children were never allowed to go. It was a room with a lock on the door. That's where there was a desk and a chair and some filing cabinets. That's where financial stuff happened. That was some kind of little home office or something. We weren't allowed in there. This was a strange room to me. We went in the room. My mom had me sit down on the little love seat, little small sofa there. And then she pulled a chair up in front of me. She looked into my eyes. She put her young, pretty hands. God, she was pretty. She was in her 20s. She looked into my eyes. I adored her. There were only 2 things I knew with certainty as a little boy: my hatred for him and my love for her. Everything else was a mystery. She looked into my eyes and she said, "I need to tell you something." I just looked at her in silence. "I need to tell you something, Ty. Charlie is not your dad." I didn't know what to think. She pulled a photo out and put it in my hands. I found myself as a little boy looking at the face of a man I had never seen before. She said, "This is your father. His name is Johnny. His name is on your birth certificate. This is your father. Charlie is not your dad." Up to that point, I thought Charlie was my dad. And I wrote on all my papers at school, at the top of my paper, Ty, T-Y, Ty Ross, R-O-S-S. I thought my name was Ty Ross. "Charlie is not your dad, Ty. Your name is Ty Gibson. This is your dad." And then she said the words that catapulted me into a whole new reality. And he never hurt your mommy. This is your dad. Charlie's not your dad. And your dad never hurt your mommy. There's a really weird sense in which, in a very little boy way, I was free. I was free in that moment. When he came home that night and began ordering people around as he would, sitting down in his chair and commanding me to unlace his boots and take them off, and if it wasn't fast enough, kicking me across the room. He stood up once his boots were off, and I looked up into his big, ugly face, and I said, "Your name is Charlie, and you're not my dad." He looked across the room at my mom, and he knew that she had told me, and he didn't care. Then came the 4th of July. He beat her so badly that she crawled from the front yard into the house with a fractured skull, broken ribs, as he sat in the front yard forcing us children, first of all, forcing us, "Don't you dare cry. Don't you dare cry. She's a bitch. How dare you? Don't cry." Plus, it's the 4th of July. Fireworks. She's crawling into the house. We sat there trembling as he set off fireworks. That night, after he passed out in a drunken stupor, my mom woke us, all of us children up, piled us into the car, and it was that night on the 4th of July that we escaped. She drove away with her 4 children into the night from Los Angeles to Phoenix, Arizona, to my grandmother's house, also my grandfather's house, but it was my grandmother's house. She let my grandfather live there. They were cool people. They didn't hit people. They did lots of other weird things. They caught things they called critters, skinned them and ate them right in the house. They were weird, but they didn't hit people. And we were there taking refuge at Grandma's house. First it was detachment for me. Then it was hatred. And then we moved back to LA. And now a single mom, as a waitress with tips, was raising 4 children in an apartment complex. And I began to grow up. And as I was growing up, we discovered, me and my friends, because most of my friends, I think all of my friends were in my predicament. I don't remember a single one of my friends who had a mom and a dad. Most of them, it was just the mom. The dad was gone. And most of the moms were like my mom. At that point, my mom was blacking out. She was an alcoholic, she was a drug addict, and she left my father, Johnny, the one who didn't hurt her, because she didn't want anything to do with drugs and alcohol. She said, "We have a baby now." That would be me. I was adorable. "We have a baby now. We can't keep partying. You need to stop all of this." She gave him an ultimatum. He wouldn't stop. She left him because she didn't want to do drugs and alcohol. But then, beating after beating after beating, she survived with drugs and alcohol and became an alcoholic and a drug addict. And there she was raising us, and me and my friends discovered that you could buy motion sickness medicine at the drugstore. Because all of us were constantly on edge. I don't remember a time in my life up until today when there's not a point at which my stomach doesn't do weird things because of involuntary anxiety. So we started taking motion sickness medicine. And then in the 5th grade, a friend brought some blue pills in the 5th grade into the bathroom. His dad was a pharmacist. He said, "Your stomach will stop hurting if you take these." My dad has a bunch of them. And he was handing them out. The first drug that I ever took after the motion sickness medicine was Valium. I just started taking it. I didn't know anything about addiction. I didn't know what it was, except that it just took the edge off. Just made me feel like maybe I could go through the day. So for me, the detachment was the gateway to the hatred, and the hatred was the gateway to self-harm. I began burning myself. The scars on my body are still there, just burning my body for no apparent reason. And in the moment, I couldn't tell you why I was doing it. I was just subjecting my body to fire. And then picking at the wounds when they would scab. And then came the drugs. First Valium, then Seconal, Quaaludes, codeine. Marijuana came later because I was so insecure about sucking smoke into my lungs that I thought all my friends would laugh at me if I coughed, because I saw people cough and they were laughed at the first time they did it. So it was very easy for me just to take pills. But then marijuana, and then something at that time that was called angel dust. I don't even know if that's a thing anymore, PCP. Then from there to cocaine, and then LSD, and it was every day. The whole day revolved around getting somewhere. It was the thing to do, to pursue, to score something and to do it. That was the definition of my existence for years. And I realized at one point that the way that I loved my mother must mean something. And as I began to grow up in my teenage years, some kind of transition began to take place where I began to, I don't know, was it just starting to mature or something? I began to think, I love her. And somehow that meant to me, I can't do this anymore. So I want to talk to you briefly about the relationship between love and addiction, because it was love that rescued me. It was first the love of my mother. Secondly, it was the love of my super hot girlfriend. And then it was the love of Jesus. The fear was overwhelming. And for the first 7 years of my marriage, this is after I'm not doing any drugs. For the first 7 years of my marriage, I had another ritual that I had to go through that was just rooted in terror. Just sheer terror. I always had to make sure there was a doorknob on whatever house we lived in for the master bedroom that would lock from the inside. It's not there, I'm not sleeping. Every night, we'd go in to the bedroom. I would have to look under the bed, in the closet, in the bathroom, behind the shower curtain, then I could go to sleep. If I was so tired that I just got in bed, the anxiety would just rise. No way. I'd have to just get up, and the whole time, my wife is just watching this. What is wrong with you? There's nobody under the bed. You don't know that. So I would go through the process. I realized at one point in my journey that I was deeply marred. I was wounded. I read this text of Scripture much later. From the sole of the foot. This is a universal description of human beings. This is, I'm sorry, this is not very flattering. This is a description of you. This is a description of me. This is a description of every person you've ever laid eyes on. In some form or another, this is a biblical description of the universal human condition. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores, and they have not been closed up or bound or soothed with ointment. That was me. I was just open wounds, open emotional wounds, psychological wounds, even physical wounds that I inflicted on myself for reasons I still to this day do not understand. Wounds. I'm going to suggest to you that there are two categories of wounds. This isn't something that I'm going to insist upon dogmatically. There could be somebody who might explain this differently. This is just me explaining to you my perspective. I think there are two categories of wounds. There are vacancy wounds and there are violation wounds. Vacancy wounds, basically something like this. Things that should have been done for you and were not done for you. Things that ought to have been done to you, like having a loving father. Every human being, you ought to have a good dad. You ought to have a good mom. You ought to be told as a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, you're amazing, I love you, I'm so glad you're my kid. And that changes brain chemistry. And you don't detach, you attach. You attach to that loving, good person who loves you. And you are nurtured in that love. But if that love is missing, you have what I'm just wrapping language around for the sake of explanation, vacancy wounds. There's a vacancy. There's something missing, right? Things that ought to have been done and were not done for you. The love of a parent, the affirmation of a friend, somebody who actually cares, that sees you as you are. Then there are violation wounds. What are violation wounds? Well, violation wounds are things that were done to you that ought not to have been done to you. This is where somebody crosses a line and violates your humanity in some way. This is violence. This is sexual abuse. This is the assault of words. I mean, think for a moment of the gravity, the sheer weight of the words in a 5-year-old's mind. I wish you were never born. Just feel the weight of that on a 5-year-old psyche. And then watch that little girl grow up and become a 13-year-old. A 14-year-old. A 15-year-old. With that wound ringing in her mind. Vacancy wounds, violation wounds. The source of the word addiction is very interesting. It goes all the way back to the 1530s. As you no doubt know, every word has the first time it was ever used. Somebody coined every word we use. You go back far enough, you can find the origin of a word. One scholar, Rebecca Lemon, studied and discovered that you go all the way back in the English language to the 1530s, and you find that the first usage, the historical roots of the word addiction, was a very positive and beautiful usage. It was a prayer. Make fast, like a fastener, like connect, like attachment versus detachment. Make fast thy promises to thy servant, which is addicted to thy worship. It's a prayer. It's saying to God, God, attach me to you. Connect me with you, because I am addicted to you. I am addicted to the worship of you. I am addicted to your love, God. So addiction itself, in the etymology, the history of the word is not, it's a neutral word. I mean, we always think of it in terms of negative addiction. But here's the thing. I'm going to suggest to you that you cannot exist without being obsessed with something. You're psychologically and emotionally and even biologically designed to be completely out of your mind for something or someone else. You're made to reach outward. In other words, you're made for love, which is, by definition, other-centered. So you're literally built for reaching out of yourself. And the source of all our problems as human beings is to turn inward. The human soul must discharge its adoration, its love somewhere. And so I find this fascinating that I quote this to everybody. If you've heard me quote this, sorry for the redundance, but the best research that has been done in modern times, in my opinion, on addiction is Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari. And he put on the table a new definition of addiction and sobriety that I think is profoundly insightful and true to my experience. He said the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. I mean, just let that land on your brain, on your mind, on your heart. If you simply, think about this, if you simply remove something, there's what do you call that? A hole. There's a space. If you simply take something away, there's an empty space. And this is why oftentimes recovery programs and recovery efforts sometimes fail, because a person simply says, I'm not going to do that anymore. Oh, really? So what are you going to do? Pray tell? Because you're going to do something. What do you mean you're just not going to do that anymore? Have you met you? You're going to do something. You may shift from one addiction to another, but you're definitely not going to survive. As one favorite song of mine says, you will not survive without love or drugs. Those are basically the options. Drugs or love. Take your pick. And Scripture, very interestingly, tells us something that I learned from the horror author, Stephen King. He even looks scary. He's a wordsmith of scariness. He specializes in making up scary sentences and paragraphs in books. He's got a vast vocabulary. This guy knows words. So a journalist asked him, hey, Mr. Scary, Stephen King, best-selling horror author of all time, 400 million books plus this guy has sold. Hey, Stephen King, what is the scariest word in the English language? He didn't even miss a beat. He said, I'll tell you, alone. That's it. Alone, that's the scariest word in the English language. Then he said, alone. Yes, that's the key word. The most awful word in the English tongue. Murder doesn't hold a candle to it, and hell is only a poor synonym for alone. Alone, that's the whole point. Have you ever seen a scary movie? Did you not notice that part of the scariness is somehow the script writer has somebody alone? With scary stuff encroaching upon them? Alone. That's the scary word. Well, Psalm 63, verses 3 through 5 says this: because your love is better than life. Better than life? My lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live. And in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully, note the language he chooses, satisfied, as with, he's making a poetic comparison. He's comparing the love of God to the richest food. Your love is better than life itself. It's so satisfying that it's like eating the richest food. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. Isn't that remarkable? So here's the bottom line. I'm pretty sure that love is the addiction that breaks all addictions. I'm pretty convinced that you're made for something that transcends anything that this world has to offer. And for me, my testimony, my story is that detachment that led to hate, that led to self-harm, that led to drugs, that the way out for me was the love of my mother, the love of my wife, my girlfriend, then my wife, same person. And it was those two women who said, hey, what about Jesus? And they were the pathway for me to the love of God that is better than life. Better than life itself. More satisfying than the teriyaki I had today. More satisfying than anything this world has to offer. My story can be summarized as a process of closing down and then opening back up. That's essentially what happened to me. Through the absence of love and the presence of abuse, I gradually just shut down. Detached, seethed inside with hatred, and then tried to self-medicate in any way I could. And then by the love of my mother and my wife, and ultimately Jesus, I began to open back up and to feel what it feels like to be human and to love again, like I remember ever so vaguely loving my mother when I was a little boy and I couldn't stand the fact that she was suffering the way that she was. That love grew into a big, giant, massive, beautiful, all-consuming love for God and for people. Thanks for your time tonight.